My name is Frank Heisler, and if anyone still remembers that name from the old faculty days, they probably picture a man with a corduroy jacket, chalk on his sleeves, and a habit of quoting lines from books no one reads anymore. I am 79 now, long retired, and I live alone in a red brick house at the edge of Detroit. The kind of neighborhood where the lawns stay neatly trimmed, but the faces change every few years. The house once carried the hum of more than one life. My wife humming in the kitchen, my son clattering through the hallway. But for more than a decade, it has echoed only with the mechanical sighs of the refrigerator and the steady pulse of the clock above the mantel. I wake early out of reflex, make my coffee the way she used to, 2 spoonfuls, no sugar, and drink it slowly by the window while the morning light creeps across the table like something shy. Retirement did not come as the collapse I once feared. It arrived like snow, quietly, until the old rhythm of lectures and grading vanished beneath it. For a few years I helped at the library, sorting donations, pretending I was still part of a world that needed people who loved words. Then the volunteer program ended, and I drifted into the domestic solitude that defines the final chapter of most lives. I keep a small garden behind the house, the only space that still answers to me. The roses she planted survive out of stubbornness rather than care, and each spring I watch them bloom with something between pride and guilt. I have everything a reasonable man could ask for. A pension, a few savings, good enough health, a mind that still obeys my will. Yet there is a loneliness that doesn't come from isolation, but from invisibility. Old age doesn't erase you. It renders you transparent. You stand in line at the pharmacy or the post office, and people's eyes slide right past, as if age itself were camouflage. That invisibility is heavier than grief. My son visits now and then, though visit is a generous word. He arrives in his SUV, leaves the engine running, brings groceries I didn't ask for, and performs a brief inspection of the house, the state of the kitchen, the placement of my medications, the expiration dates on milk. He asks if I've been eating properly, if I remember to take my blood pressure pills, if I've considered selling the place and downsizing. He speaks as though I were an aging piece of property in need of assessment. His wife stands nearby, smiling too much, speaking too carefully, using the word we as if it were a rope she could pull me with. They mean well, I suppose, but their care feels like rehearsal. I can almost see the bullet points of their conversation before they arrive. Still, I tell myself not to be bitter. They have their lives, their schedules, their children, whose names I forget to say out loud, because the silence that follows feels too long. I sometimes imagine calling them just to ask about school or weather, but I stop myself. I know that tone, the one people use when they speak to the elderly, warm but distracted, like they are already looking for the exit from the conversation. Evenings are the hardest. After dinner, when the dishes are done and the house folds into quiet, I sit at the table with an open notebook. I call it my journal, but it is more of a confessional ledger, a record of thoughts I can't share with anyone living. I write about small things, the smell of the lilacs, the memory of my wife's handwriting on shopping lists, the feeling of losing a word halfway through a sentence. Sometimes I write about my son when he was a boy, when he used to run into my classroom after lectures and beg me to let him erase the chalkboard. He'd cover his sleeves in white dust, proud of helping, laughing the whole time. I keep those images like fragile relics, reminders that love once had an uncomplicated shape. The world outside has grown unfamiliar. I used to know every corner of this neighborhood, every dog by its bark, every neighbor by name. Now the houses have been remodeled into identical gray boxes, and strangers wave from driveways where friends once stood. There is only one familiar face left across the street, an old widow who still dries her laundry outdoors and greets me as Professor, as if time had not retired me from that title. Sometimes she brings pie and pretends it's because she baked too much, but I can see the pity behind her generosity. I accept it anyway. Pity is still a kind of company. I tell myself that routine is a blessing. I wake, I brew coffee, I water the plants, I walk to the market when my knees allow it. These tasks create a rhythm, and rhythm is what keeps despair from taking root. Yet beneath that pattern there is a faint unease, a sense that the world has begun to move around me, like water around a stone. My mind is clear, but I have caught the worried glances of my son when I search for my glasses or repeat a story. Once, I left the kettle boiling too long and filled the kitchen with steam. That small mistake became a sermon about safety and responsibility. I apologized, but the apology felt like surrender. Lately, their visits have become more frequent, but shorter, like inspections rather than conversations. They rearrange things, the medicine cabinet, the pantry, and I notice small absences after they leave. Old papers moved, mail stacked in a different order, the spare key missing from its hook. Nothing major, just enough to unsettle. When I ask about it, they laugh it off. "We're just trying to help, Dad." The word help has a strange taste now. It feels like the first step toward ownership. Last week my son called with a cheerful voice that didn't quite reach the ends of his sentences. He said they were planning a little family meeting for me. "We just want to make sure you're comfortable," he said. "Talk about how to make things easier." His phrasing was too polished, the kind of language people use in business presentations. I agreed, of course. I've learned that resistance only feeds their concern. But when the call ended, I sat at the table for a long time, staring at the phone, feeling a slow pressure building behind the calm. Families rarely hold meetings to make one person's life easier. They hold them to decide what to do with him. That night I poured myself a small glass of whiskey, something I haven't done since my wife's funeral, and watched the light fade behind the maple trees. The house seemed to breathe differently, as if it too sensed what was coming. I thought of the stories I used to teach, the tragedies that begin not with storms, but with conversations gentle and polite, that open doors which can never be closed again. I told myself not to be dramatic. Perhaps it was simply an act of love. But love, I've learned, has many disguises, and some of them look a lot like pity. Still, part of me hoped I was wrong. I even cleaned the living room that week, dusted the shelves, arranged the old photographs, proof of a life that, despite its solitude, still had meaning. I placed the picture of my wife on the mantel, the one where she's wearing a red scarf and laughing into the wind, and I caught myself whispering, "Wish me luck." The sound of my own voice startled me. It had the tremor of a man bracing for a verdict he already suspects. I went to bed early, though sleep didn't come. The house creaked in the quiet, and the ticking of the clock grew louder, steadier, until it felt less like time passing and more like something counting down. Somewhere between the tick and the tock, I realized what frightened me most wasn't the thought of losing control of my home or my money. It was the possibility that they might convince the world, and eventually even me, that I had already lost control of my mind. And once people decide an old man can't be trusted, there's no argument that can save him. I lay there until dawn, the first light washing over the ceiling, thinking that maybe tomorrow would prove me paranoid. But deep inside, I already knew the truth. The meeting they planned wasn't about care. It was about custody. And when they came to my door, smiling and gentle, I would open it, pretending not to know that it was the beginning of the end. It was a Thursday when the call came, and I remember it because Thursdays had become my grocery day, a small structure I clung to in the shapelessness of retirement. The phone rang just as I was tying my shoes, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something about the persistence of the ring felt deliberate, as if refusing it would carry consequences. When I picked up, my son's voice came through bright and falsely casual, the way people sound when they're about to ask for something but haven't yet decided how to disguise it. He told me they had planned a little surprise for the weekend, a family get-together at my house. He used the word celebration, though he did not specify of what. "We just want to spend time together," he said, and there was a rustle of paper in the background, the sound of him multitasking as always, organizing even while pretending to be spontaneous. I asked what I should prepare, but he told me not to worry, that they would bring everything. "You just relax, Dad. You've done enough hosting in your life." There was something rehearsed in his tone, too symmetrical, as though the kindness had been practiced. After he hung up, I sat for a while at the kitchen table, staring at the reflection of the ceiling light in my coffee. I wanted to feel pleased. It had been a long time since my family voluntarily gathered for anything that wasn't a birthday, and even those were usually abbreviated events ending in polite exits. But the more I turned the conversation over in my head, the more it seemed to shimmer with something underneath the surface, a careful choice of words, a faint nervousness. "We'll bring everyone," he had said, and that word, everyone, struck me as strange. Our family was small. There were no distant relatives to summon, no cousins or uncles who appeared suddenly after years of silence. Everyone, in our case, meant him, his wife, and their 2 children, neither of whom had set foot in my home in more than 3 years. Why now? Why all at once? The days leading up to that Saturday stretched with a kind of quiet tension. I cleaned the house more thoroughly than necessary, as though cleanliness could prepare me for something I could not name. I even bought fresh flowers, yellow chrysanthemums, because my wife used to say they made the room look awake. The weather was unseasonably warm for early spring, sunlight pooling through the windows, yet I couldn't shake the chill that lingered behind the anticipation. On Friday night, I laid out the good china, though I suspected they would bring disposable plates, as they always did. The small absurdities of preparation felt like a performance I was staging for no audience but my own conscience. I told myself I was being foolishly sentimental, that I should be grateful for the attention, that suspicion was just another symptom of aging. Saturday arrived soft and bright, and by noon I was sitting by the window, watching the street. When they finally pulled into the driveway, it was not 1 car, but 2. My son's large silver SUV led the way, followed by a smaller sedan I did not recognize. For a moment I thought perhaps they had brought friends, an odd choice for a family visit, but still conceivable. The car doors opened, and I saw them step out one by one. My son was dressed not in his usual casual weekend clothes, but in a pressed shirt and slacks, the kind of outfit he wears to work. His wife followed, holding a tray covered with foil, her expression bright, too bright, the smile of someone performing hospitality rather than offering it. Then came the children, lanky, disinterested, scrolling on their phones, barely glancing at the house. From the second car emerged a woman I had never seen before, holding a leather bag and a clipboard, followed by a man in a gray suit who looked more like a banker than a friend. When I opened the door, they greeted me with a chorus of exaggerated cheerfulness, the kind that fills space rather than warms it. My son hugged me, quick and awkward, and said, "You look great, Dad." in the same tone he might use to compliment a client on a new office chair. His wife placed the tray on the counter without asking, and I caught her eyes scanning the room, cataloging everything with silent judgment. I turned toward the strangers, expecting introductions, but for a moment none came. Finally, my son cleared his throat and said, "Dad, this is Ms. Green. She's a family counselor, and this is Mr. Bishop, from the County Social Services. They're just here to chat a bit, to make sure everything's going smoothly." The words hit me in fragments. Counselor, social services, just here to chat. I nodded slowly, though a heavy pulse began to throb behind my temples. They all filed into the living room, the air thick with polite tension. I stood by my chair, unsure whether to sit or offer them seats. My son gestured toward the couch. "Let's all get comfortable," he said, as if this were a routine meeting. I noticed that Ms. Green, the woman with the clipboard, had already begun taking notes, her pen gliding quickly, and the man beside her had placed a small digital recorder on the coffee table without asking. I stared at it, then at my son, who avoided my gaze. "Frank," Ms. Green began, her voice syrupy, professional, the tone of someone accustomed to calming frightened people. "We're here today because your family cares deeply about you. They've noticed some things lately, small things really, that made them a little worried. Forgetting to turn off the stove, missing a few appointments, that sort of thing." I felt my mouth go dry. I opened it to respond, but she continued before I could. "This isn't about judgment. It's about making sure you have the support you need." I looked at my son, but his eyes were fixed on the floor. His wife sat beside him, hands clasped, pretending concern. The grandchildren barely looked up from their phones. My house, my quiet, familiar house, had turned into a tribunal. I felt like a defendant who had been invited to his own trial under false pretenses. "I appreciate the concern," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I'm fine. I manage perfectly well on my own. I cook, I drive, I handle my finances." My son shifted uneasily. "Dad, no one's saying you don't. We just think maybe it's time to start planning, before something happens." "Planning what?" I asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. Ms. Green smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Sometimes families consider appointing someone to help with daily responsibilities, bills, medical decisions, small things that can become overwhelming." It took me a moment to understand what she meant. When it landed, it did so with the weight of betrayal. "You mean a guardian," I said quietly. "You're talking about taking control of my life." The man from social services leaned forward, his hands folded neatly. "It's not about taking control, sir. It's about ensuring safety and well-being. Your son just wants what's best for you." I turned to him then, really looking at him, at the careful neutrality in his face, the bureaucratic calm of someone who's done this many times before. "And did my son also tell you," I asked, "that he's been asking about my accounts, my property, my will?" The room tightened. My son exhaled through his nose, a sound of mild exasperation rather than guilt. "Dad, please, let's not make this adversarial. We're trying to help you stay independent for as long as possible." "By declaring me incompetent?" I said, my voice sharper now. "By bringing strangers into my home without asking?" His wife's tone was soft, condescending. "No one's accusing you of anything, Frank. We just want to make sure you're not overwhelmed." I wanted to laugh, but what came out was something closer to a gasp. I looked around at their faces, each expression carefully arranged into sympathy, and realized that the meeting had been planned down to the smallest detail. The notes, the recorder, even the seating arrangement were part of a performance designed to make me look fragile, confused, cooperative. And in their eyes, I was already halfway to being that man. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant barking of a dog outside. Then Ms. Green asked if I'd mind taking a short memory assessment. Just a few harmless questions. My son nodded encouragingly, as if I were a child being coaxed into swallowing medicine. I stared at her clipboard, the printed forms, the pen poised to reduce me to checkboxes. "No," I said finally. "I won't be taking any tests today, and I want you all to leave." She tried to soften it, to reframe it as misunderstanding, but the pretense had already cracked. My son rose slowly, tension stiffening his shoulders. "Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not making it harder," I said. "You are." His wife murmured something to him, too low for me to hear, and then turned toward me with the weary patience of someone dealing with a stubborn patient. "We'll come back another time," she said. "Maybe after you've had a chance to think." I watched them gather their things, the strangers first, my family last, filing out of the house in the same rehearsed order they had entered. My son paused at the door, looking back at me, his expression unreadable. "We love you, Dad," he said. "We just want to keep you safe." Then they were gone, and the door closed with the kind of soft finality that sounds like the end of something that used to matter. I stood in the quiet, surrounded by the faint scent of their cologne and the unnatural stillness they had left behind. On the table, the recorder still blinked red, forgotten in their haste. I pressed stop and held it in my hand, feeling its small, cold weight. Outside, the afternoon sun was starting to fade, and the first shadow of evening stretched across the floor. Somewhere in that silence, I understood that the world had shifted, that from this moment on, every kindness would come with an angle, every conversation a hidden clause. The family meeting had not been a celebration. It had been a verdict delivered with smiles. And though the sentence was not yet carried out, I could already feel the walls closing in. That night, sleep hovered, but never landed. I drifted between half-dreams and long stretches of wakefulness, each sound in the house transformed into a small alarm. The refrigerator's hum seemed conspiratorial, the wind against the window accusatory, and every creak of the wooden floor felt like the echo of the voices that had filled the living room only hours before. When dawn arrived, it did not bring relief. It simply revealed the evidence of the previous day, the coffee cup still on the table, the faint mark of the recorder on the wood where it had rested, and the flowers on the counter beginning to wilt. I moved through the kitchen in slow motion, touching things without purpose, as if verifying that they were still mine. By late morning, the phone began its intermittent ringing. I let it go unanswered. Then came the doorbell, persistent, mechanical, demanding. I opened it to find my son standing on the porch, alone this time, holding 2 paper cups of coffee like a peace offering. His eyes were tired, his voice rehearsed but quieter than usual. He said he wanted to talk, just the 2 of us. No counselors, no officials, no drama. The phrase, "no drama," made me want to laugh, though there was nothing funny about it. I let him in. He placed 1 cup on the table and sat without waiting for an invitation. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just looked around the room, as if seeing it for the first time. Each object, each photograph, each trace of a life he had already decided was slipping away. Then he began to explain himself, calmly at first, with that managerial gentleness that sounds like empathy, but functions like control. He said the meeting had been a misunderstanding, that no one wanted to take away my independence, that they only wanted to ensure I was protected. Protected from what? I asked, and he hesitated just long enough to make the silence louder than any answer. From mistakes, he said finally. From people who might take advantage of you. The world's not kind to seniors, Dad. I reminded him that I had lived 79 years in that same world and had managed just fine without his protection. His face hardened, and the conversation lost its veneer of diplomacy. He accused me of being stubborn, of refusing to face reality, of creating unnecessary tension in the family. He spoke of the burden of worry I was placing on him and his wife, as though my continued autonomy were an act of cruelty against them. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that what he feared was not my decline, but my control over my house, my money, and, by extension, the small moral advantage that children lose when their parents outlive their usefulness. He told me they had already spoken with a lawyer about drafting what he called a voluntary guardianship agreement, a phrase that carried the logical elegance of a trap. It would, he said, simplify legal matters in case something happens. Something, that convenient abstraction that could mean anything from a fall in the kitchen to a gradual surrender of self. When I asked who would serve as the guardian, he said calmly, I would, of course. You trust me, don't you? The question was both plea and challenge. I wanted to answer with the truth, that I trusted him as one trusts a surgeon holding a knife for too long, but I only nodded slightly, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of open conflict. He took my silence as consent and began explaining how easy it would be, just a few signatures, a matter of paperwork. I stopped him mid-sentence and told him I needed time to think. He agreed too quickly, which told me he had already planned the next step. After he left, the quiet settled, like dust. I sat for hours, reading the same paragraph of a book without understanding a single word. My son's words replayed themselves in loops until they blurred into something like background noise. I realized that he was no longer seeking cooperation. He was establishing a narrative. In that narrative, I was not the father who raised him, but a confused old man resistant to help. A man whose judgment could no longer be trusted. Once that story took root, it would grow faster than I could fight it. The next day confirmed my suspicion. The mail brought a letter on official letterhead from a family wellness program, informing me that a routine home evaluation had been scheduled in cooperation with your relatives. It was phrased like a formality, yet the subtext was unmistakable. Refusal could be construed as evidence of incapacity. I placed the letter on the counter beside the vase of dying flowers and stared at it until the words seemed to fade. I felt the strange helplessness of someone trapped in a play he didn't audition for, watching the scenery build around him while the exit disappears. By the following afternoon, the phone calls resumed. My son, his wife, a woman from the county office whose voice was practiced in the art of gentle intrusion. I said little, mostly listened, each conversation another thread in the web tightening around me. They spoke of safety, of responsibility, of how times have changed. Every phrase carried the same quiet condescension, the assumption that my age had already transformed me into a figure of diminishing competence. When I hung up, I found myself talking aloud to the empty room, defending my sanity to no one. That evening, a car slowed in front of the house, its headlights cutting through the curtains. It lingered there for a long minute before pulling away. I told myself it was nothing, a lost driver perhaps, yet the sight of those lights burned into me. The following morning, I discovered that my mailbox had been emptied. Not just the junk mail, the entire contents, including the envelope with my bank statement that I had been expecting. I called the postal service, who promised to look into it, though the tone of the clerk suggested it would be filed under minor irregularities. Unease had settled into me like a second heartbeat. I began checking the locks twice, sometimes 3 times before bed. The world outside seemed to tilt slightly, no longer the same neighborhood I had known for decades. Even familiar sounds, the echo of a lawn-mower, the shriek of the garbage truck, felt sharper, as if the air itself had become suspicious. I realized that fear, once invited, doesn't leave politely. It rearranges the furniture of the mind, moves everything an inch out of place. 3 days after the so-called family meeting, my son returned again, this time without calling first. He came at dusk, carrying a folder and a polite smile. I let him in, because not letting him in would only confirm the story he was building. He began with small talk, asking about my health, about the garden, about whether I'd considered hiring someone to help around the house. Then, as if it were an afterthought, he opened the folder and slid a stack of papers across the table. The pages were covered in legal language, paragraphs dense with terms like representation, power of attorney, and financial management consent. He spoke quickly, explaining that this was simply an update to my existing documents, something routine that would prevent bureaucratic headaches later on. I skimmed the first page and saw my name beside his, but the rest blurred into incomprehensible legal phrasing. When I said I would rather have my own lawyer look at it, he smiled tightly and said, "Of course, Dad. Whatever makes you comfortable." But I saw disappointment flicker behind his composure. He collected the papers and stood to leave, saying he'd come back in a few days. Before he reached the door, I asked him one question. "Why are you in such a hurry?" He paused, hand on the doorknob, and answered without turning around. "Because time doesn't slow down for anyone, Dad. Not even you." Then he was gone, leaving the faint smell of cologne and the echo of his footsteps retreating down the walkway. That night I sat at the kitchen table long after dark, the house lit only by the stove lamp, the papers still spread out before me like a map of an unfamiliar country. Somewhere between the lines of legal jargon, I could feel the outline of my disappearance. I thought of the counselor's recorder, of the official letter, of the missing mail, all pieces of a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. I needed to act, not react. So the next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called an old acquaintance from my teaching days, a man who had left academia for law. He answered on the second ring, surprised but warm. And when I explained the situation, his voice changed from nostalgic to professional calm. He told me to make no more phone calls to my son, to sign nothing, and to keep any correspondence that arrived. He said he would come by the next afternoon to talk in person. Before hanging up, he added, "Frank, don't panic, but be careful. This happens more often than you'd think." The phrase, "this happens," chilled me more than any accusation could have. The next 24 hours stretched endlessly. I moved through the house as though under surveillance, half expecting the doorbell to ring or another car to idle outside. Every object around me, the framed photographs, the books, the familiar furniture, had taken on a strange unreliability, as though it could be used as evidence against me. I tried to read, but the words refused to stay still. I tried to write, but my hand trembled slightly, betraying me. I finally turned off the lights and sat in the dark, waiting for morning like a man hiding from his own life. When the lawyer arrived the next day, he was dressed casually, carrying a briefcase and a quiet seriousness that steadied me. We sat at the same table where the ambush had taken place, and I recounted everything: the counselor, the social worker, the papers, even the missing mail. He listened without interruption, his fingers steepled, his eyes narrowing slightly at certain details. When I finished, he asked if anyone might have legal access to my accounts or property. I admitted that my son's name appeared as a secondary contact on some old bank forms. He nodded slowly and said, That's where it starts. We'll fix it." Then he suggested something that seemed absurd at first. The next time my family visited, he wanted to be in the house, unseen. He said people reveal their truest intentions when they think they have already won. That night I barely slept again, but for the first time my insomnia carried purpose rather than panic. I made coffee at dawn, watching the street from behind the curtain. The neighborhood was quiet, deceptively so, the kind of quiet that conceals rather than comforts. I thought of my son's expression, the cold certainty behind his concern, and I understood that the next confrontation was inevitable. The trap had been set once. It would be set again. But this time someone else would be listening. The morning of the next visit arrived with the kind of stillness that feels staged, as if the air itself were holding its breath. I woke before sunrise, long before I needed to, and stood at the window for almost an hour, watching the neighborhood take shape out of the gray. The trees moved with the kind of slow rhythm that always precedes rain, and the sky, heavy and low, carried a sense of warning. I made coffee but did not drink it, the smell alone enough to ground me in something familiar. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Every second an announcement the time was moving towards something I could neither stop nor delay. My lawyer was already in the house, sitting quietly in the small room off the kitchen, where the old radiator hissed like a whispering conspirator. He had arrived early, discreet, bringing with him not just his briefcase, but a small recording device he had tested twice, ensuring it worked. He had told me to act naturally, to let things unfold. "The best evidence," he said in his calm, professional tone, "is the kind that collects itself." When the knock came at 9, it was soft, polite, the kind of knock people use when they want to appear harmless. I opened the door to find my son standing there again, this time without his wife, but carrying that same air of authority he had worn during the so-called intervention. He smiled, a carefully composed expression that didn't reach his eyes, and asked if he could come in. I stepped aside and let him enter. His cologne filled the space immediately, too sharp for morning, cutting through the faint scent of coffee. He glanced around, noticing that the house was tidier than usual, that the documents from the previous visit were no longer on the table. "You've been keeping busy," he said, his tone halfway between approval and suspicion. I didn't respond. He sat down at the table, placing a folder before him with the care of a man laying out evidence. "I didn't want to upset you last time," he began, "but this can't wait any longer. There are forms that need to be signed, so we can make sure your finances are handled properly. You've had a few late payments recently, and the insurance company has been trying to reach you." The statement was so confidently delivered that for a moment I almost doubted my own memory. I had never missed a payment in my life. He leaned back in the chair, watching my reaction, mistaking my silence for confusion. Then, with a sigh that was half performance, he said, "Dad, I know it's hard to admit when things start slipping. It happens to everyone eventually." There it was again, that gentle, patronizing tone, the prelude to control. I asked him where he had heard about any late payments, and he said he'd been in touch with my bank to make sure everything was in order. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with a kind of burning anger that felt strangely clarifying. "You had no right to do that," I said. He shrugged, as if the issue were trivial, and replied, "I'm your son. I have every right to look out for you." The arrogance of it hung in the air between us. He opened the folder and slid the papers across the table again, the same ones I had seen days earlier, but now stamped with additional signatures, his and someone else's. "I've already taken care of the preliminary parts," he said. "You just need to sign at the bottom, and we can submit it. It's basically just confirming that I can act on your behalf for financial matters." His voice softened, as if speaking to a frightened child. "This isn't about control, Dad. It's about peace of mind." I looked at the papers but didn't touch them. The paragraphs of small, dense print might as well have been written in another language. I recognized only fragments. Durable power of attorney, authorization, full access. He must have taken my silence as resistance rather than deliberation, because he sighed again, this time louder, theatrically weary. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said. "Melissa and I just want to make sure you're okay. We can't keep driving over here to check on you every week." His words were meant to sound reasonable, but beneath them ran the clear implication that my independence had become an inconvenience. I reached across the table and closed the folder gently, pushing it back toward him. "No," I said. "I'm not signing anything today." His eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation breaking through the mask of patience. "Why are you being like this?" he asked, the softness draining from his voice. "Do you think I'm trying to hurt you? You've been forgetting things, Dad. You left the stove on last month. You lost your mail. You told me the same story twice in one conversation. I'm trying to help." The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it was close enough to sound plausible. "You're not helping," I said quietly. "You're replacing me in my own life." He laughed once, short and sharp. "That's ridiculous. Nobody's replacing you. We're just trying to make sure things don't fall apart when—" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. "When what?" I asked. He didn't answer. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Then, as if on cue, the doorbell rang again. He looked at me, feigning surprise. "That must be Ms. Green. She said she might stop by to check in." The words sent a pulse of dread through me. Another unannounced visit, another staged concern. I hesitated, then went to the door. There she was, the same counselor, her clipboard clutched like a weapon of politeness, her face arranged in professional sympathy. Behind her stood another man, this one younger, wearing the badge of a local health agency. They stepped inside before I could protest. "I just wanted to follow up after our last conversation," she said smoothly, glancing around the room as though assessing the scene for her report. "Your son mentioned you were still a bit uncertain about the assistance plan." The assistance plan. The phrase was new, but the intention was old. I turned toward my son, who was standing now, arms crossed, pretending calm. "You invited them here?" I asked. He didn't deny it. The woman began to talk again, her words a stream of bureaucratic reassurance. She spoke of safety protocols, of risk assessments, of community resources for aging adults. The younger man began asking questions, seemingly harmless at first. Did I cook for myself? How often did I leave the house? Did I ever feel disoriented while driving? Each question carried the weight of potential misinterpretation. Every answer could be twisted into proof of decline. I could feel the lawyer's presence in the next room, like a held breath, silent but listening. At one point, Ms. Green asked if she could take a quick look around the house, just to make sure everything's safe. I told her no firmly, and she paused, making a small note on her clipboard. "You seem agitated," she said softly, her voice a performance of concern. "No," I replied. "I seem aware." My son tried to diffuse the tension, but his attempt only exposed the coordination between them. "Let's not argue," he said, looking at me but speaking to her. "He gets defensive sometimes." That sentence, those 3 words, "he gets defensive," felt like the sound of a door locking from the outside. I saw then what they were building, a case not of facts, but of impressions. Each look, each tone, each word of mine could be entered into evidence against me. The lawyer stepped out of the kitchen then, calm and unhurried, his presence sudden but commanding. "Good morning," he said evenly. "I'm Mr. Lang, representing Mr. Heisler. I'd appreciate it if all questions were directed through me from this point forward." The effect was immediate. Ms. Green blinked, startled, her practiced composure faltering. The younger man looked at my son, uncertain. My son's face went pale, and for a moment the room was perfectly still, the kind of stillness that follows the sound of something breaking. Lang moved with the quiet authority of someone who has done this before. He walked to the table, picked up the folder of documents, and flipped through it quickly, his eyes scanning the signatures. "Interesting," he said, his voice measured but sharp at the edges. "This appears to be a durable power of attorney drafted without Mr. Heisler's consent. Did you prepare this yourself?" My son stammered something about just being proactive, but Lang cut him off. "Proactive would have been consulting your father, not forging his participation." Ms. Green tried to intervene, insisting that everyone was acting in good faith. But Lang turned toward her, his tone turning formal. "Are you aware that recording devices were used during your previous visit without Mr. Heisler's consent? Because I have a copy of that session, and I assure you, it demonstrates a level of coercion that could be considered legal intimidation." Her mouth opened, then closed. The young man with the badge stepped back slightly, sensing trouble that exceeded his pay grade. I stood there watching the unraveling, the performance collapsing in real time. My son looked smaller somehow, not younger, just reduced, like a man suddenly aware that his own story had been overwritten. Lang continued speaking, explaining calmly that any further contact would have to go through him, that any attempt to access my financial or medical records without my explicit authorization would constitute fraud. Each word he spoke restored something I hadn't realized I'd lost, the sense that I was still the subject of my own life, not its object. When they finally left, the silence that followed was thick with shock. I sat down at the table, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the release of it. Lang placed the folder in his briefcase, locked it, and looked at me. "It's not over," he said quietly. "They've started something, and people like this rarely stop after the first setback. But now we have proof. Let them make their next move. We'll be ready." I nodded, unable to find words. Outside, the rain that had been threatening all morning began to fall in slow, heavy drops, tapping against the windows like a slow applause. The house, once a stage for humiliation, had become, for now, a fortress. I felt the strange calm that comes not from safety, but from clarity. The line between concern and control had finally been drawn, and I knew that the next chapter would not be about defense, but confrontation. It took almost 2 weeks before the next move came, and those days were a study in uneasy calm. The house felt different after that confrontation, as though some invisible wire that had been tightening around me had finally snapped. For the first few mornings I woke with a kind of quiet triumph, drinking my coffee by the window with the satisfaction of a man who had outsmarted the trap set for him. My lawyer, Lang, came by twice during that time, each visit brief but deliberate. We reviewed documents, secured my accounts, and placed alerts on all major institutions so that no one could make inquiries or withdrawals without my explicit presence. He made me sign new forms, this time under his supervision, and he kept copies of everything in his office. "You have to assume," he told me, "that they won't stop just because they've been embarrassed. When people are motivated by money or guilt, they come back wearing different masks." His words stayed with me, hovering somewhere in the back of my mind, even when the days seemed peaceful. At first, I mistook the silence that followed for surrender. My son stopped calling, no letters arrived, No cars lingered outside. The absence itself became suspicious, too clean, too deliberate. Then, one morning, I went to the pharmacy to refill my prescription, and the pharmacist, a woman who had known me for years, gave me a peculiar look when I handed her the slip. She said my insurance coverage had been temporarily adjusted, and that the new policy required pre-authorization from a designated family member. I told her there must be a mistake. I had never listed anyone for such authorization. She shrugged apologetically and suggested I contact the insurance company. I spent the afternoon on the phone, listening to automated menus and hold music, only to learn that a legal representative had recently been added to my account, my son's name again. I felt the air leave me as if I'd been struck. He had managed to wedge himself into my life through another door, quiet and procedural, the way termites move unseen until the wood starts to collapse. I called Lang immediately, my voice tight with panic. He told me to stay calm, that he would handle it, but there was a gravity in his tone that unsettled me. By the next morning, he had already spoken with the insurance company's legal department and discovered that a faxed document bearing what appeared to be my signature had authorized the change. The signature, he said, was a near-perfect imitation. Someone had clearly practiced. He assured me that a notarized statement would reverse the change, but his next words were heavier. "Frank, this isn't just opportunism anymore. This is strategy. He's building a paper trail to make you look inconsistent, to create confusion about who's actually managing your affairs. If we don't get ahead of it, you could find yourself buried under so much documentation that truth stops mattering." The following days were filled with small shocks. Letters began arriving addressed to the Heisler family estate, a phrasing that chilled me. Bank statements I had never requested appeared in my mailbox, showing transactions I didn't recognize but bearing my account number. One afternoon, the postman handed me a certified envelope, which turned out to be a notice of property tax reassessment, prompted by a request from the co-owner. I spent hours at the county office, explaining and proving that I had never added anyone to the deed. The clerk listened politely, but looked skeptical, the way bureaucrats do when faced with an old man insisting on his own competence. Each interaction, each form, felt like being slowly erased by paperwork. The pressure began to take a physical toll. My hands trembled more than usual, and sleep became fragmented, haunted by dreams of signatures crawling across documents like ants. I tried to maintain normal routines, watering the plants, reading the paper, walking to the market, but even those small acts felt invaded by suspicion. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder when I stepped outside, half expecting to see a familiar car idling at the curb. One afternoon I thought I did. The same silver SUV that my son drove, parked 2 houses down. When I walked toward it, it pulled away before I could get close enough to see the driver. That night, I called Lang again. He told me to document everything, times, dates, descriptions, because eventually a pattern would become evidence. He came over the next morning unannounced, carrying a briefcase heavier than usual. He laid out papers across the table, each one connected to a different institution: banks, property offices, medical providers. He explained how each could be used to manipulate an elderly person's legal standing, how narratives of concern often masked attempts at control. What they're trying to do, he said, is create a picture of you as a man who can't keep track of his own life. Once that picture exists, it becomes reality to the people who matter: banks, doctors, judges. Truth loses to consistency. You need to reclaim the narrative. I asked him how. He smiled slightly, as if he'd been waiting for that question. By letting them speak freely again, and this time will capture every word. It happened sooner than I expected. The following Sunday, as the late afternoon sun stretched long across the lawn, the phone rang. I answered without checking the caller ID. It was my son. His tone was softer now, cautious, but not contrite. He said he wanted to clear the air, that the last visit had gotten out of hand, that he felt terrible about how it had gone. We shouldn't be fighting, he said. We're family. The word family landed like a stone. I asked him what he wanted. He said only to talk, just the two of us, no papers, no professionals. Against my better judgment, I agreed, though a part of me knew he would not come alone. After we hung up, I called Lang, who told me to keep the line open and to record the conversation if possible. Be cordial, he said. Let him think you've softened. Sometimes confession sounds like reconciliation. When the knock came the next day, it was early, the light still thin. My son stood there again, this time with his wife. Both of them wore the look of people about to make an apology they didn't believe in. They brought a store-bought cake, the kind with plastic flowers and the words, "We love you, Dad," piped in blue icing. I invited them in. The air between us was thick with forced warmth. They sat at the kitchen table, complimenting the house, commenting on how well I looked, asking about the garden. I answered politely, feeling like a spectator in my own life. After a few minutes, the conversation shifted. My son cleared his throat and said, "We've been thinking maybe we came at this the wrong way. Maybe we pushed too hard. But the truth is, we're scared for you. Things can happen fast at your age. We just want to be prepared." His wife nodded, adding, "It's not about control, Frank. It's about love." Love. That word, so casually weaponized, scraped against my patience. I said nothing, letting them fill the silence with their assurances, their small rehearsed anecdotes about friends who had to take over their parents' finances after a stroke or a fall. Every example was a ghost story told to frighten me into submission. I watched them talk, my hands folded on the table, my face calm. When my son finally took out a new set of papers, smaller this time, just a single page, he said it was a simple consent form, allowing him to coordinate communication with financial institutions. He presented it as if it were an act of mercy, something he was reluctantly forced to do for my own good. I took the paper, unfolded it, and pretended to read, though my eyes were fixed on the faint reflection of the hallway where I knew Lang's small camera was hidden, its lens no bigger than a pinhead. I looked back up and said, "You're asking for my trust." He nodded. "You already have it," I said, "just not in the way you think." He smiled, mistaking that for surrender. He began explaining the clauses, and the more he spoke, the clearer his motive became. There were references to temporary co-management, joint authorization, and revocable consent, all legal disguises for permanent control. He must have spent days with a lawyer of his own, crafting language that sounded protective but hollowed me out from within. I let him finish, then asked a simple question. "Who drafted this?" His answer came too fast. "Just a standard form I downloaded online." The lie was clumsy. His wife shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in temperature. I leaned back, folding the paper neatly, and placed it on the table. "You know," I said slowly, "your mother used to say the truth has a smell. When someone lies, the air goes stale for a moment. I smell it now." His face reddened, the composure cracking. "Dad, please, this is ridiculous." But the anger in his eyes betrayed him. I could see it clearly, the frustration of a man whose performance had gone unrewarded. Then something unexpected happened. Their daughter, my granddaughter, appeared in the doorway. I hadn't realized she had come with them. She stood there awkwardly, holding her phone, her expression uncertain. She had probably been waiting in the car, but curiosity must have drawn her inside. She looked from her father to me, then back again, sensing the tension. "What's going on?" she asked. He told her it was just grown-up talk, but she didn't move. "You said you were coming here to help Grandpa," she said quietly. "You said he couldn't handle things anymore." The words landed like stones dropped into a still pond. His wife's eyes widened, and she reached for the girl's arm, but the moment had already passed. The silence that followed was irreversible. My son tried to recover, to smooth it over, but the damage was done. The sincerity in his daughter's voice had revealed the truth of their conversations behind closed doors. I saw the panic flicker in his expression, the realization that witnesses could no longer be controlled. He stood abruptly, muttering something about needing to go. His wife gathered the cake, the paper, and the fragments of their dignity. The girl lingered a moment longer, her eyes on me, soft with something like apology. I managed a small nod before they left. After the door closed, I sat very still, listening to the sound of their car pulling away. Lang stepped out from the kitchen, holding the small device that had recorded everything, the conversation, the lies, the accidental confession. "That," he said, "is gold." He placed the recorder on the table and looked at me. "You've done perfectly. They just gave us everything we needed." But the victory was not satisfying. I felt no joy, only exhaustion and a grief that had no proper name. The people who once carried my future in their small hands had now tried to take away my past, rewriting me as someone incompetent, helpless, disposable. Lang stayed a while longer, making copies of the recording, labeling each file carefully. Before he left, he said, "The next step is exposure. You don't fight this kind of thing in private. You drag it into the light where they can't twist it anymore." That night I sat by the window, the house dark except for the small pool of light from the lamp beside me. The recorder lay on the table, its tiny red indicator flashing like a heartbeat. Outside the street was quiet, ordinary, innocent in its silence. I thought about the word family and how it can mean both safety and captivity. How love can rot into something that still resembles love if you don't look too closely. I thought about my wife, about the way she used to touch my shoulder when she wanted to quiet my temper, and how she would have hated all of this. As midnight passed, the fatigue that had settled in my body refused to become sleep. I found myself whispering aloud, not a prayer, but a statement, a vow spoken into the empty air. "I'm still here. I remember everything." And as the words left me, I realized that survival, in its truest form, is not merely keeping the body alive. It's protecting the truth of who you are when everyone around you tries to redefine it. The weeks that followed moved like a long corridor leading to a door I could already see, but couldn't yet open. Lang worked with a quiet precision that bordered on obsession. Every few days he brought updates, letters drafted, evidence cataloged, witnesses identified. He spoke the language of law with the calm of a man used to storms. But behind his composure I could sense something like restrained anger, the kind that grows from watching injustice repeat itself too many times. He said cases like mine had become common, that adult children often built campaigns of benevolent deceit, trying to seize control under the banner of protection. The courts, he warned, rarely looked beneath the surface unless someone forced them to. That was what we were preparing to do, to pull the mask away, to make them see what had been hidden behind the smiles and the words, "We just want to help." I thought I was ready. But when the official summons arrived, the paper itself seemed to tremble in my hands. A hearing had been scheduled at the county probate court, filed by my son's attorney. The petition accused me of progressive cognitive decline, financial mismanagement, and self-neglect, and requested temporary guardianship to be assigned to my son pending evaluation. It read like an obituary written by a stranger. Attached were statements from neighbors, all brief and vague, likely gathered under the guise of concern. One said I often seemed confused about dates. Another claimed I had difficulty remembering conversations. Lies built from fragments of truth. The petition was accompanied by copies of medical forms I had never signed, one bearing a crude imitation of my signature. My son had even included the incident with the stove as evidence of dangerous forgetfulness. I sat there reading each page, feeling the paper grow heavier, until Lang reached across the table and took it from me. "They've made their play," he said. "Now it's our turn." The day of the hearing came cold and gray, the kind of weather that erases color from the world. I wore my best suit, the one I had not used since my wife's funeral, and polished my shoes until they reflected the ceiling light like small black mirrors. Lang met me outside the courthouse, steady and focused, carrying his briefcase as if it were a weapon. "They think you'll appear frail," he said, adjusting my tie slightly. "They're expecting defeat. Don't give them that pleasure. Speak slowly, clearly, and look at the judge, not at them." I nodded, but inside my chest the old rhythm of panic had begun to stir. We entered the courtroom, and there they were, my son, his wife, their lawyer, sitting together at the opposite table. My son avoided my gaze, but his wife met it directly, her expression unreadable, a mixture of pity and defiance. The lawyer beside them, a young man in an expensive suit, spoke in hushed confidence, flipping through folders. Behind them sat a social worker and the same counselor, Ms. Green, whose presence made my pulse quicken. I took my seat beside Lang, who gave me a brief, reassuring nod. When the judge entered, everyone stood. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a voice that carried quiet authority. The proceeding began with the petitioner's side presenting their case. My son's lawyer stood and delivered a well-rehearsed narrative. An aging father slipping into confusion, unpaid bills, unsafe living conditions, misplaced medications. He cited the letters from neighbors, the alleged medical reports, even a supposed incident of disorientation when I had been seen walking at night near the park. A simple evening walk transformed into evidence of instability. I sat still, my hands folded, listening to my life being rewritten in front of strangers. When they called Ms. Green to the stand, she spoke with the polished compassion of a professional witness. She described me as resistant to assistance, paranoid, emotionally volatile. Her words were soft, but they carried the sting of poison hidden in sugar. I watched her hands as she gestured delicately, the same hands that had once scribbled false notes in my living room. Then my son took the stand. For the first time in months, I heard his voice without a screen or a filter. He spoke gently, carefully, pausing at all the right moments, playing the role of the devoted son forced into an impossible position. He said he loved me, that he was only doing what was necessary, that he could not stand by and watch his father endanger himself. The performance was perfect, and as he spoke, I saw the judge's face soften slightly. He ended by saying, "All I want is to make sure he's cared for, that he doesn't suffer because of pride." Pride. The word hit me harder than any accusation. It was a clever choice, framing autonomy as vanity, turning dignity into a flaw. When it was our turn, Lang rose slowly, adjusting his glasses with deliberate calm. He began by acknowledging the difficulty of such cases, the emotional complexity, the good intentions that sometimes lead to terrible actions. Then he shifted tone. "But this," he said, holding up the petition, "is not an act of love. It is a calculated attempt at dispossession." He moved methodically, dismantling their evidence piece by piece. He revealed the falsified documents, pointing out inconsistencies in signatures, the absence of notarization, and the lack of verification from any licensed physician. Then he played the recording from the so-called intervention. Their voices, the coercion, the manipulation, the clear pressure to sign documents. The courtroom, which had been politely still, turned electric. Even the judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as the recording played my son's voice saying, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." When it ended, Lang allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "This," he said quietly, "is not the voice of a caregiver. It is the voice of someone rehearsing control." He then called my granddaughter to testify. I hadn't known he would. She entered hesitantly, her small frame almost swallowed by the courtroom size. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, it grew steady. She told the judge how she had overheard her parents talking about taking over Grandpa's accounts, about getting things done before he figures it out. She said she hadn't understood everything then, but now she realized what it meant. There was a hush in the room when she finished, the kind of silence that belongs to truth breaking through performance. My son's lawyer objected, of course, claiming emotional manipulation, but the damage had been done. Finally, Lang asked if I wished to speak. My instinct was to decline. I wanted to stay invisible, to let the facts defend themselves. But then I looked at my son, his rigid posture, his clenched jaw, the refusal to meet my eyes, and I realized that silence would be another surrender. I stood, my knees unsteady but my voice firm enough to carry. I told the judge about the meeting, the lies, the forged signatures, the feeling of being turned into a caricature of incompetence by the people I had trusted most. I spoke not with anger, but with exhaustion, the kind that comes from realizing your love has been used as leverage against you. I said, "If I am guilty of anything, it is of believing the family is a sanctuary. I see now that it can also be a weapon." When I finished, there was no applause, no dramatic outburst. The judge simply nodded and said she had heard enough. The recess that followed felt endless. Lang and I sat in the corridor, surrounded by the low murmur of other cases, while my son's family huddled at the far end, whispering furiously. I didn't look at them. I watched the rain slide down the windows instead, each droplet tracing a slow descent, erasing itself in silence. When we were called back in, the judge read her decision. Her voice was steady, official, but beneath it I sensed the weight of something human. She dismissed the petition in its entirety, citing insufficient evidence and unethical conduct in the collection of testimony. She ordered an investigation into the falsified documents and the misuse of my personal information. And then she looked directly at my son and said, "Your father is not incompetent. What I see here is a man who has been systematically undermined under the pretense of care. This court will not allow that." The sound that followed was not quite relief. It was something deeper, quieter, like breath returning after being held too long. My son sat motionless, his face drained of color, his wife staring at the table. Lang exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of a smile touching his mouth. I didn't look back as we left the courtroom. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp and clean. For the first time in months, the sky looked open, like a promise, rather than a warning. In the car, Lang said little. He only told me that there would be follow-up paperwork, perhaps even criminal charges if the forged documents were traced back to their source. But his voice softened as he added, "You did something today that most people can't. You reclaimed your name." I watched the city pass by through the window, buildings dissolving into light and motion. Somewhere between exhaustion and clarity, I felt the ache of everything that had been lost. The trust, the simplicity, the quiet illusion that love was immune to ambition. Yet beneath that ache, something new stirred, a strange, unfamiliar peace. I had fought not just for property or autonomy, but for the simple truth of being believed. When Lang dropped me off, I stood on the porch for a long time before unlocking the door. The house smelled the same: coffee, dust, the faint ghost of my wife's perfume still clinging to the curtains. I walked to the living room, placed my hands on the back of the chair where I had once sat surrounded by accusation, and whispered into the empty air, "It's over." The words felt fragile, temporary, but real. Outside, the last light of the day broke through the clouds, falling across the photographs on the mantel, catching my reflection in the glass. For a moment, I saw not an old man fighting irrelevance, but someone who had survived the theft of his own story and won it back. The days after the hearing passed in a kind of slow astonishment. I kept expecting something to happen, a knock on the door, a phone call, another letter. But the silence that followed was complete. The storm had ended, though the air still trembled with its aftertaste. For the first time in what felt like years, I could walk through my own house without scanning for evidence of intrusion. I began to move differently, not cautiously, but deliberately, as if reclaiming a physical language I had forgotten. The kitchen looked brighter, the garden larger, the walls somehow less oppressive. I found myself speaking aloud again, narrating small acts to no one. Boiling water, opening the curtains, feeding the birds that had begun to gather near the porch. These gestures were not about loneliness, but about reasserting presence, as though every word spoken into the quiet reminded the house and the world that I was still here. Lang came by a few days after the ruling, his briefcase lighter this time, his expression almost relaxed. He said the investigation into the falsified documents had been transferred to another department and that it might take months before any official outcome. He offered to keep monitoring things, but he suspected my son would stay quiet for a long while. Humiliation, he said, is a better deterrent than punishment. I didn't argue. There was nothing left in me that wanted retribution. What I wanted was distance, clean and final, the kind that no apology could bridge. Before he left, Lang placed a sealed envelope on the table. "Your new estate plan," he said. "Updated, notarized, and filed. Everything goes where you want it to go. Nobody touches anything without your signature." I opened it after he left, scanning the lines with a strange calm. The language of law, once menacing, now felt protective, like a fence built around memory. I wrote a letter to my son, though I never mailed it. In it, I said everything that could not be said in a courtroom, that I did not hate him, that I did not even wish him ill, but that something irreversible had been broken between us. I told him that betrayal, when it comes from strangers, wounds pride. When it comes from blood, it rewrites identity. I said I hoped he would one day understand what it means to have your voice doubted, to be turned into an unreliable narrator of your own life. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with the others, unsent words meant for a future that will never arrive. Spring came late that year, as if the season itself had been hesitant to return. The snow melted slowly, uncovering the garden in uneven patches of brown and green. I spent mornings outside, kneeling in the damp soil, cutting away dead branches, feeling the ache in my knees like a small but loyal reminder of life. The roses, stubborn as ever, began to show signs of revival. I thought of my wife as I worked, remembering the way she used to talk to the plants, her voice soft but insistent, as if coaxing them into faith. The memory didn't hurt the way it used to. It carried a kind of acceptance, a gentle ache that asked for nothing but acknowledgement. Neighbors began stopping by again, the way people do when they sense a story has ended and feel safe reappearing in its aftermath. They brought pies, casseroles, awkward questions disguised as sympathy. "We heard about what happened," they would say, careful not to mention how little they had heard, how little they had said when the rumors were spreading. I accepted their kindness without resentment. It wasn't forgiveness, just fatigue. Age teaches you that people rarely stand by during another's humiliation, not because they are cruel, but because they are afraid of proximity to suffering. They confuse silence with safety. One afternoon, while sorting through the old boxes in the attic, I came across the notebook I had been writing in during those darker months, the one I called my confessional ledger. The pages were filled with restless handwriting, words that oscillated between fury and despair. Reading them felt like looking at someone else's life, a man cornered by his own fear, writing just to prove that his mind still worked. I closed it gently and placed it back in the box. Some stories are meant to remain unfinished. Later that evening, I sat in the living room, the windows open to the soft air, the faint scent of earth and rain drifting in. The recorder Lang had used during those visits still lay in a drawer, its small red light long dead. I picked it up, turned it in my hands, and wondered if I should throw it away. Instead, I placed it beside the photograph of my wife on the mantel. It seemed right that it stay there, a silent witness to what had been endured. For a moment, I imagined her voice, the way she would have scolded me for letting things get so tangled. And then, after a pause, the way she would have smiled with quiet pride. She had always believed that truth finds its way out eventually, no matter how many hands try to bury it. In the weeks that followed, I began donating things, books, old clothes, furniture that no longer felt necessary. I contacted a foundation that supports elderly people facing guardianship abuse and offered to leave them the house after my time. The rest would go to the library where I once volunteered. When I signed the new will, the notary asked if I had any immediate family I wished to include. I said no. There was a brief silence, and then she nodded, not pressing further. I realized that the word family, once sacred, had become simply factual, stripped of sentiment, but not of meaning. Sometimes, at night, I still wake suddenly, convinced I've heard a car in the driveway or footsteps outside. Old fears linger like echoes, refusing to dissolve completely. But they no longer rule me. I lie there, breathing steadily, waiting until the house settles back into its rhythm. I think about the word sanity, how fragile it seems, how easily people can steal it from you with a few signatures and a soft voice. And yet, I also think about endurance, the quiet kind that doesn't shout or demand recognition. Survival, I've learned, is not about being untouched by betrayal. It's about continuing to believe in your own voice after it has been doubted by everyone else. Now, when the mornings come, I open the curtains wide and let the light flood the room. The garden glows, the air hums faintly with bees, and for a brief, merciful stretch of time, the world feels aligned again. I still talk to my wife sometimes, though less out of loneliness than gratitude. I tell her that I kept my name, my house, my mind. I tell her that even after everything, I am still the man she knew, just older, lonelier, and a little more awake. The story does not end with forgiveness or reconciliation. It ends with a simple truth. I am free. Not in the way youth once promised, not through adventure or discovery, but through endurance. The door they tried to close on my life is open again. And though the corridor beyond it is shorter now, it belongs entirely to me. I sit by the window as the evening light fades, listening to the quiet pulse of the house. And for the first time in years, the silence feels like peace rather than waiting.